we have our second speaker ready. As you can see, connected online, Professor John Wyatt with us already. A round of applause. The most important thing, Professor John Wyatt, can you see me? Me, the most important person. No, okay, second important question, can you see us?
Hi!
Okay, good.
Hi.
Can you hear us? Yeah, we can hear you very well. Can you hear us fine? Is it okay?
Okay.
Okay, right, okay. So you can, I suppose you can see most of us, right? Can you?
Yes, I can, yes.
Good, okay. And we have friends from Faraday Institute. Do you recognize them? Can you see them?
Yes, I recognize them.
Okay, good. Right. We have Dr. Dennis Alexander with us, Dr. Andrew Jackson with us as well. Okay? Right. So, I know that, as we know, you know the background of Professor John Wyatt, so I'm not going to repeat the question. He's going to speak on technology and human nature. Without further ado, I will just hand it over to Professor John Wyatt. Can we give him a round of applause?
Okay, well, it seems very appropriate to be using technology to be able to speak to you today. It's 3:30 in the morning here in the UK. I'm having to speak not too loudly because I don't want to wake the rest of the household.
Love your neighbors.
But I see many friends from my visit to Hong Kong earlier this year, and it's really great to be able to participate in this fascinating symposium and series of lectures and discussions. I'm going to talk probably for about 20 minutes, and then there'll be a chance for discussion. If the sound drops out or anything, if you can wave at me, or things that don't come across clearly, so that if necessary I can repeat myself. So it's a great privilege for me to be able to take part and give this talk. I want to say straight away that I'm not a professional theologian or philosopher. My background is very much as a practicing clinician, working as a paediatrician, particularly in a very technological area of medicine, and that is caring for critically ill newborn babies. So it's a sophisticated form of intensive care, involves sophisticated technology, life support technology. And as I went into this area, I went into it really because I love children and because it was a fascinating and rapidly developing area of medicine. But the more I worked in this area, the more I realized that I was in the midst of huge ethical debates and dilemmas, which were very much related to advances in technology. As the technology increased in its power and effectiveness, it raises more and more questions about, was it right to resuscitate every baby, however premature? Was it ever right to switch off life support machinery and allow a baby to die if there was evidence of brain damage or other severe problems? And one of the most troubling and complex issues was that I was working in an intensive care unit which was dedicated to saving the lives of extremely premature and tiny babies, and just one floor away in the same hospital was the fetal medicine unit, which was dedicated to detecting abnormalities of the unborn baby, the fetus, and when abnormalities were found, parents would be offered an abortion, and frequently abortions were being carried out, and sometimes at very advanced stages of gestation. And sometimes I was being called to counsel women who were considering having an abortion because of an abnormality of the fetus, and the baby in the mother's womb was considerably bigger and tougher and stronger than the babies that we were trying to care for in the intensive care unit one floor away. And so this is just a very real illustration of the challenges that advancing technology raises. And that was really because of my experiences that I've become more and more interested in the area of medical ethics and the implications of advancing technology. And that's really been now my focus. I'm now no longer working as a practicing clinician, but working in the area of medical ethics and the implications of technology. And seeing the friends from the Faraday Institute, I just mentioned that I'm particularly interested at the moment in issues to do with artificial intelligence and robotics and what the implications are for our humanity of a society which is dominated by intelligent machines. So to focus on the question today, is it appropriate to use technology to actually change our own human nature, to change the structure and the function of our bodies? And I've been influenced by the Canadian philosopher George Grant in his writings on technology, and I recommend them to you. He comes from a Catholic position, but I found his writings very insightful, and he emphasizes that a fundamental goal of technology is the mastery of nature, and that includes both the environment, but it also includes our very own human nature. And in some sense, it seems that the mastery of human nature is the final frontier for the technological progress, or what some people call the technological project. And the fundamental idea is that we don't have to accept the limitations of our human nature. That for thousands of years, philosophers and writers and artists have talked about something that's sometimes called the human condition, of our frailty and limitations, of our vulnerability, of our dependence. And the argument we can use technology to fundamentally change the nature.
Okay, Professor John Wyatt.
humanity.
Professor John Wyatt.
Hello.
We just lost connection for maybe 15 seconds. So if you
Okay.
can repeat, right, the material in the past 30 seconds maybe?
Okay. Thanks. So the idea is that whereas previously philosophers talked about the human condition as being something that we had to accept, was a given, I think the new idea, or at least it's not that new, the idea is that we can use technology to fundamentally change and improve, advance human nature. And that a fatalistic acceptance of the givenness of human nature is no longer appropriate. It's interesting that you can trace this idea at least back to the European Enlightenment in the 18th century, and particularly in the French encyclopedists such as Diderot. And it's interesting to see that Diderot, in an age where the most sophisticated technology was clockwork and steam power was not evident, and yet he was already looking forward to an age when humanity could redesign itself. And so the philosophers of the Enlightenment saw this as a natural outcome of the Enlightenment project, but it's interesting that it's taken 250 years or more for the technology to catch up to a point where those original Enlightenment dreams can now be put into reality. And I suggested reading the article by Nick Bostrom in Defense of Posthuman Dignity, which was in the anthology. And Bostrom is a very interesting person. He is a philosopher in Oxford, and he calls himself a transhumanist, and that this is a recognizable philosophy, which is particularly coming from the west coast of America. Surprise, surprise, it's California, which is really the foundation, the fount of transhumanism, but it's spreading across into many parts of the world. And Bostrom is one of the most thoughtful advocates. And he argues in that essay that human beings have morphological freedom. They are free to change their shape and form however they wish, and they have reproductive freedom. They can create new lives in whatever form they wish. And Bostrom argues that this is entirely appropriate, that human beings should be able to explore and change their nature, and they can do it entirely according to their own desires. Although he talks about something called humane values. So interestingly, the transhumanists, by and large, combine their love of technology, a very pro-technology approach, with at the same time left-wing political desire for justice and for social values. So and sometimes it's quite an uneasy mix, you can see in their writings. Bostrom has been in debate and discussion with a group of ethicists who are now often labelled bioconservatives, as those who wish to conserve human nature. And one of the frequent criticisms that bioconservatives make of posthumanism is that if we modify our own human nature, we will lose the intrinsic dignity of what it means to be human. We will create some strange post-human beings, and that this is somehow a threat to intrinsic human dignity. But Bostrom, in the article, argues against this. I think that it's helpful to see that there is, I think, a fundamental incoherence, a philosophical incoherence with this position, which I would be interested to get your reactions to this. But it seems to me that Bostrom and many other modern thinkers put a huge emphasis on autonomy, the right of the individual to choose their direction, and that means that the right of the individual to choose their own body, to what they do with their body, and to choose to change their body. And so this is what he means by morphological freedom. It's I, the choosing self, can do whatever I like with my body. And of course, a rather crude example of that is the rapid growth of cosmetic surgery, which in a way is a crude version of this kind of phenomenon. I'm not satisfied with the body I have. I want to completely redesign my body, and I'm prepared to pay for it. And nobody can tell me that I shouldn't do this with my body. So the choosing self is regarded as free to change the nature of the body in which it resides. So in some way, the self stands free from the body and exerts its will on the body. But it's clearly different from the body in this way of thinking. If you emphasize personal autonomy, you end up with a philosophical dualism, where the self is a sort of immaterial choosing entity which operates on the body in which it happens to reside. But philosophical dualism is actually profoundly problematic, and it's particularly problematic for modern scientists and materialists or physicalists. So according to the dominant ideas of neuroscience, the idea of a self is merely an emergent phenomenon that is created by neuronal activity within the brain. In other words, the self is merely a product or expression of the body, and it is completely dependent on the body. So there's a profound incoherence, it seems to me, behind Bostrom's view that the self is free to change the body when the self is itself a product of the body. The other thing, of course, is this is a huge problem with autonomy, the concept of autonomy, is that none of us is free from constraining influences and pressures. Our choices, which seem to be free, are in fact profoundly influenced by the society in which we live, including all those people who wish to advertise and influence and change our opinions. So I sometimes illustrate this by saying you are completely free to choose whatever fluids you drink. You have total autonomy. You can drink whatever you like. So isn't it surprising that so many billions of people across the planet choose to drink Coca-Cola? Their autonomy turns out to drive them to drink Coca-Cola. And of course the reason for that is that the profoundly powerful advertising techniques which are constraining autonomy and pushing them in certain directions. And in less extreme ways you can see the same is true with cosmetic surgery. And one of the most painful things to me is the way that young women with very beautiful and unmarred bodies are choosing to have mutilating surgery to change their bodies more like a pornographic fantasy of men. So to use surgery to enhance their breast size and reduce the size of their waist is another example where autonomy is not as free, as genuinely free as it sounds. It's in fact constrained by social pressures and norms. So just thinking about Christian responses to these very deep challenges, the commonest Christian response that I'm aware of is to see the attempt to enhance and change our bodies as a threat to the goodness of the original creation. And this view tends particularly to come from those from a Reformed or conservative Protestant or evangelical position, and also from a Catholic perspective. And within this view, our human nature, with all its inherent limitations, is actually to be celebrated because it is part of the original creation plan, which is described in the Genesis narrative as very good. And therefore, we, rather than to try to change our human nature, real wisdom is to accept the human nature that has been given to us in creation by a loving and beneficent Creator. And I have been very influenced also by the thought which takes that view and takes it further because of the significance of the incarnation. So when God himself, in the person of Jesus, takes on human flesh, and he subjects himself to all the limitations of the human nature. He is dependent, he gets tired, he needs to be cared for as a baby. He experiences all the limitations of our human nature. And then in the resurrection, when he is raised as a physical and tangible and recognizable human being, as Oliver O'Donovan says, this is God's final vote of confidence in human nature as originally given. The risen Christ is an authentication and an affirmation of humanity in its original form. it has to be said there is another Christian focus and position which tends to come from liberal Protestant perspective, and this view tends to emphasize the idea that the creation, although the creation was good, it was only partially complete. It is unfinished. And they believe that as human beings, part of our creation mandate is actually to enhance the creation. And sometimes this is used in the term of being a co-creator. Although we are created by God, we can work with Him and collaborate with Him in the work of co-creation, exploring the potentialities which God has put in the universe. And so it is argued that the human body has potentialities for enhancement, for improvement, and that this is part of God's purpose for us. And a further element of this view is that God's final purpose for humanity is to be glorified, and that technology may be part of the means by which humanity is to be glorified. It is a way in which God's final eschatological purposes for humanity can be brought into made a reality through the use of technology. So it's obvious that our understanding of creation from a theological perspective is going to influence our responses to this kind of technology. If we emphasize the goodness of the original creation, we are prepared to accept our human nature with its limitations. On the other hand, if we emphasize the incompleteness of the creation, then we're going to be more open to its enhancement, development of human nature. I do think it's helpful to see that for thinkers such as Bostrom, and this really again goes all the way back to the Enlightenment, the natural order, the way that reality is often seen as a constraint. It's something that limits our possibilities, it limits our freedom, it constantly gets in the way. And so, in this way of thinking, true freedom, the freedom which we as human beings deserve, is to break out of the natural order, is to somehow overcome all the restrictions and limitations which the natural order gives. And so the natural order is seen as something restricting, cramping or limiting. But it seems to me that a more authentically Christian position is to see the natural order not as a constriction, not as a limitation, but part of God's intention for how we should flourish. That human flourishing happens when we accept that the natural order is how we are meant to be, and we learn what it means to explore all the potentialities within the natural order. We don't try and break out of the natural order, we accept that these are the limits that the natural order gives, so we are then free to become what we were meant to be. So, if we come back to the world of medicine, and as I said, I worked in a highly technological, sophisticated kind of medicine, I felt that it was appropriate to use this technology caring for extremely sick babies, because my aim and intention was to restore this very sick and vulnerable baby to the position of what a healthy baby should be like. And the healthy baby, the normal healthy baby, becomes the norm, the goal, and all the technology is orientated towards restoring this sick and vulnerable child, and maybe a malformed baby, towards normality, towards what a normal healthy baby should be. So medicine often traditionally has operated with this understanding of what is healthy, what is normal. That's what we aim for. And so, for instance, as a paediatrician, when the mother comes to me and says, well, I'm very happy with my newborn baby, except that the baby screams all night and always seems to be hungry, and this is really upsetting me, and it's meaning that we can't sleep and my children can't sleep. My response as a paediatrician is not to say, well, we must find some technology to make sure that your baby never cries again. My response as a paediatrician is to say, well, I'm sorry, but that's what babies are like. Welcome to being a parent. Because I have an understanding that this is what normal healthy babies are like. So technology is orientated towards restoration, it's not orientated towards changing the design. And I found the analogy of a art restoration to be a helpful analogy. So art restorers working in an art gallery take an old painting which has been subject to all kinds of injuries and damage. They use highly sophisticated technology, but their aims of the technology is entirely restorative. And interestingly, art restorers have a code of ethics, and the code of ethics that art restorers work by says that the original artist's intention is normative. All the technology has to be orientated towards restoring the manuscript as the original artist intended. But art restorers are not free to use their technology to improve on the painting. To say that Michelangelo could have done a bit better here, and I'm going to improve on what Michelangelo did. Instead, they accept the artist's original intention. And so, in that, as an analogy, we should use sophisticated technology to restore the masterpiece of the human body, but we shouldn't use technology to change the design. And that is a way of thinking between restorative therapy versus enhancing therapy. Now, I understand that that's, as all analogies are, this has limitations, and the distinction, how do I know when I'm restoring the masterpiece and I change the design? There is a grey zone when it's sometimes not at all clear where the boundaries between restoration and enhancement goes. For instance, if we could use technology to increase the immunity of the body to diseases so it never became subject to bacterial infection, is that restoration or is that enhancement? And so there are issues and issues to debate, but nonetheless I think the distinction is fundamentally helpful. I think another issue which I struggle with, and that is there's a sense in which we use technology all the time to enhance our bodies. Every time you use a telescope or a microscope, you are enhancing human senses. I'm enhancing my ability to speak using technology so I can speak across the world. Have we not already accepted that we are enhancing our human nature using technology that is external to the body? Is there a fundamental difference between using a telescope so I can see further and having my eyes implanted with technology so that I don't need to use a telescope any longer, because simply by seeing I can change the magnification in my retina? Are these fundamentally different? Is one acceptable within Christian thinking, whereas the other is unacceptable because it's changing the body? So these are issues which I continue to puzzle with and would be very interested to discuss further. But I've no doubt that the ideas of the European Enlightenment of enhancing the body are going to become more and more pressing I think within the next 20 or 30 years we're going to see a growth of all kinds of technologies intended to bring new capabilities to human beings. So as Christians we really need to think about these issues and how we're going to respond to it. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Wyatt, for your very clear, structured talk and such very good humor.